Why Linux sucks. What Linux is supposed to be is the ultimate in computing. Future-proof, past-proof, because it has the ultimate fundamental design. That's what's being sold. As Linux is so great, you only need to learn how to use it. And you can do anything a computer can theoretically do because you're using Linux. I'm talking here about GNU Linux and why GNU Linux sucks. GNU Linux sucks. So, some easy disqualifiers just to prove why it sucks is if you hear people say Linux can't play games, then you'll try to hear Linux proponents and fanboys defend it by saying Linux can play these games. The thing is, if you're using Linux, games should not even be in the question because you're using the best production operating system. So the fact that they reply with, "Oh, Linux can play these games," they're defeating their own point because there should be no games on Linux, except that they should just be able to run because Linux is a perfect system. But not that you should have to defend Linux because you can't play video games. Because video games should not be for Linux. Um, and then a second thing, is people will say, "Oh, well, Linux is so great because look at all the things that run Linux." And they use this as proportion to why you should use GNU desktop Linux. And they say, well, look at Android is Linux, and PS4 is Linux, and servers are Linux, and your IoT is Linux. And what's really funny is when they say stuff like the PS4 is Linux, because the PS4 is, I'm pretty sure, BSD, Berkeley Software Distribution, which is a Unix-like operating system, but it's not Linux, and it's because the difference is you can modify BSD and not share your source code after you modify it. And so the people that say, "Oh, the PS4 is Linux," the PS4 is not Linux. The PS4 is BSD, Unix-like operating system. But they use these things to say, well, this is why desktop GNU Linux is good. But it's not. Desktop GNU Linux sucks balls. I don't really like saying that, but it does. It's really bad. It's horrible. Um, yeah, so you can't compare Android, which runs in the Linux kernel, and then uses Java. And this is the funny thing. It's that Linux people always love to hate on Java. And it's like, oh, Java's so insecure, Java this, Java that. But then they come out and say, oh, Android, look at Android, it's so great because it runs Linux. It runs the Linux kernel and Java on top of that. Or I'm not sure how it all works, but it runs the Linux kernel, then the um the Dalvik, not the Dalvik virtual machine, but the new virtual machine that runs on Android, so it can run on Java. Yeah, so, but it's not the same thing. Android is not Linux, the Linux they're selling. And they'll try to say, like, you know, the more obscure the distribution of Linux, the supposedly better it is. Which the problem is there's no support. So you get told all this stuff. And then when you go ask, okay, well, now that I'm here, and now that I'm reading all the documentation, and you ask how to do something, it's, oh, well, always do your own. And the funny part about that is you could basically have a Linux guy, and here's how the conversation would go. And the guy's gonna say, basically the goal is, yeah, okay, so let's just start off with, this is just like how Linux would tell you to do it. So a guy wants to use his desktop to watch YouTube. And what you would say is, well, you can't watch YouTube if you're using Linux because that's a GUI and you need to use command line. So you can't watch a video in command line. Or if you have oh yeah. So let's say you have a question like how do I watch YouTube in Linux? The answer would be, well, you compile your own browser. And then you would say, well, how do I do that? And then they'd say, well, you need to build your own compiler. Then you say, how do I build my own compiler? And they say, well, you need to learn assembly. Or you need to build your own operating system. It's basically, the funny thing is it comes down to that. It's like Linux just always do it the hard way. You can't do it. And if you apply this to any other part of life, it's not a joke. It's like you can't go to the bakery because they use white wheat. That's 99% white wheat or something. And you can't use that because they do one thing wrong. So you need to bake all your own bread. But more than that, you need to grow. You need to ship all your own. You need to drive all your own. You need to drive to pick up all your own bread, and you need to grow all your own bread. And then here's where the super Linux stupidity comes in. You need to create all your own plants. You need to create all the genetics, create all the cells, create everything from scratch. And then it just keeps going infinite regression. Oh, you need to create the atoms. If you really want to be good at Linux, you need to create the atoms. If you really want to be good at Linux, you can't just create the atoms. You have to create the atomic structure that builds the atoms. Then you can use Linux. It's just an infinite regression of, if you don't know how to do it, well then build it yourself, or you should know how to do this. And then the funny thing is a lot of people that say they use Linux, they secretly use Windows or Mac. So I was talking to a cool guy, and he was showing me Linux and a setup that he was using for a file server, which is not the same thing as desktop Linux. A server is not the same thing as desktop Linux. So he was showing me his file server, and then I asked him, hey, can I see some of your work? And so he pulled out his Mac, which he uses to make iPhone apps. And it's such a joke that, Linux is supposed to be the perfection in computing, and you ask someone how they do their work, and they pull out a Windows or a Mac. And the other thing that gets sold with Linux is that it's so stable it can never have any errors. Yet when you try to do anything as simple and logical, it either takes 4 hours to do it with 2,000 keystrokes, or it just doesn't work at all. So a lot of simply logical stuff just won't work. And on top of that, you have things that are supposed to work that don't work, and you have errors. And there's nothing more frustrating having an obscure error with zero documentation and zero help on something that's just supposed to work. Something simple that's just supposed to work. So this is, I guess, part 1 of my Linux rant, and Linux is really annoying and it sucks. Desktop Linux sucks. I repeat, desktop GNU Linux sucks.